Last week there was an election in Kuwait. The franchise was limited to maybe 1/3 of the male residents of the country. And of course, women were not allowed to vote. And the radicals won overwhelmingly. Now, it would be difficult to name a nation anywhere in the world, especially a Muslim nation, in which the influence of the United States has been more benign than it has been in Kuwait. It owes its existence to the United States. Does this not indicate, I ask all of you this, but I'm going to quote particularly in two places that Dr. Gunaratna says that radical Muslims are only a minuscule percentage of all Muslims. Now, I think most of your written statement, Doctor, is contrary to that. That the support, at least passive support, is much broader. If we have not succeeded in Kuwait in creating a society which is reasonably liberal, how in the world do we, or does any Western country that is not Muslim tell Muslims what true Islam is? I'd like any of you to comment on that.
Just because I was recently in Kuwait and I followed the elections and all of that, probably I can say something about this. Sir, one of the main lessons from the Kuwaiti elections is that, one, the Muslim Brotherhood lost and gained only 2 seats. And some Salafi radicals, yes, won. The jihadist group certainly won seats, especially the Walid al-Tabtabai and others who are very much anti-US. But it is very important to understand in this context that Kuwait, compared to the neighborhood, at least women in Kuwait, I saw them driving their cars and running around. Yes, they did not get the suffrage. The Emir of Kuwait put out a request for the parliament last time, and again the Islamist radical forces clamped down on this, and women could not get the vote. But it is very important throughout the Middle East, not Kuwait alone. One thing that we are not getting thus far, whether it is in Iraq or Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, is that we need to hear gratitude for what we do in that part of the world. In fact, governments are unable to come forth and say we are friends of the United States. And I think our problems throughout the Middle East is really about an approach that's developed over the years, that somehow we tolerate Arab leaders telling us something in private rooms and let them deal with their public the way they want to. It is very important for friends of the United States to stand by the United States and speak out that indeed Kuwait was liberated by the United States. None of the Muslim or the Arab world, if it were left for the devices of the Muslim or the Arab world, Kuwait would have been occupied until this day. It is very important that the governments come out, but and be grateful. Even in Iraq, it is very important that the Iraqi people come out and be grateful. The question for Kuwait, I like the idea that Kuwait is experimenting with democracy, whether it includes radicals or non-radicals. It's very important that to bring these people in a dialogue. The one problem in Kuwait which remains is the international element of the Muslim Brotherhood, represented by a group named Al-Islah, that basically has tremendous finances and capable to recruit. But Kuwait was good enough to refuse the spokesperson of Al-Qaeda to be handed to Kuwait from Iran recently. So it's very important to really push the government of Kuwait into really being forthcoming on the question of Islamism, the question of also finances. But we have to realize that also they are limited in their means. We have to technically assess these things in tracing the finances that goes to Al-Qaeda and other organizations. But I wouldn't be very worried when some members, even if they are extremists in their views, are part of the parliament. I would be terribly worried about...
Well, they are a substantial majority of the parliament now, are they not?
I don't think they will affect. They are right now about probably 10 members of parliament, including, still the government has the majority thus far. It's very important that we tell the government of Kuwait very clearly that gratitude is the essence of friendship. And if you talk publicly and increase the talk publicly about we are friends of the United States, and people come out and speak about their gratitude, then the media can affect everybody. But the Islamists and the radicals are practically taking advantage of an atmosphere where everybody is quiet about their friendship of the United States. So everybody is on the run because leaders are unable to come out and say, we are friends of the United States, and here are the reasons why, and here are the reasons why these guys are wrong. Right now, nobody is telling them that they are wrong, whether it is in Saudi Arabia or in Egypt or everywhere else.
Okay, go ahead.
So I want to make 2 points. One is, I would still say that in the Muslim world, it is a minuscule of the Muslims that actively support terrorism. There may be a larger percentage that supports the various causes that have been spearheaded by these organizations. But in terms of active support, the people who give money, the people who carry the explosive device and place it, it is still a minuscule. If we look at worldwide, support for violent organizations, whether it is in Northern Ireland in terms of support for the IRA, we have seen a maximum of 15% of the public will support organizations that engage in terrorism. Maximum 15%, with one exception, that is the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. About 60% of the Palestinians support suicide terrorism. That is because there's a very high percentage of the Palestinians who have been politicized and radicalized and mobilized by groups like Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. But other than that conflict, I would say that most other conflicts we will find less than 20% of any population in any Muslim country will actively support terrorism. This may change with time. This may change, especially after 9/11, especially after US intervention in Iraq. But prior to that, we have not seen evidence of greater support, not sympathy, but support for terrorist organizations.
May I make a comment?
Certainly.
Although I defer to my esteemed colleagues, I think that the fear is probably greater than the reality here in Kuwait. What needs to be done is discrediting those extreme movements that are about to capture a lot of countries in the Muslim world. At this point, I don't think we have a stronger popular support in the Middle East than Iran. And why? I think because the mullah have been discredited in Iran. Their policy, see, it's a promise that everything will become like paradise that's really attractive to all the population. They're faced with repressive regime, they're faced with corrupt governments, and so they try something new, a little bit like Algeria tried to do. And once those people will be in power, you'll see that there is absolutely no substance behind their policies. Now, the key here is not to allow them to gather, like in Iran, all the levels of power to kind of prevent other people from running or standing for election, even if they do, like Iran, that they have no power whatsoever. So this is really the one provision that we have to insist that, fine, let fundamentalists take over the government, and after 5 years, you'll see the whole population turn around.
But isn't the fundamental problem of antipathy, whether highly radicalized and involving terrorism or passive distaste of the West, a result of the 300 to 500 year reversal of roles in the world? And is there any possibility that there can be a true prosperity in the Middle East or in the Muslim world as long as 50% of the population can't effectively participate? The whole female part of the population? And how does that change given the fundamental basis of Islam itself?
Well, again, I think if you look at Iran, where the women vote, this has changed quite a bit. It seems that the support really comes from the base and not really from the top government. Actually, if you eliminate the top 2,000 in the government, you'll have a very pro-American country. Remember, this is a country that had spontaneous demonstration in support of the United States right after 9/11, in the whole Middle East. What happened is that after a period of decolonization, a lot of Middle Eastern countries chose the secular socialist route. And this is what has been discredited, and this really led to the popularity of fundamentalist movements. They have to kind of go through a process of learning. Otherwise, still, the promise will be there, and unless you kind of give in and kind of give them what they want for a while and realize that there's nothing there, they're not going to stop being attracted to it.
Dr. Fandy?
Yeah, I just want to I think it is very important what you said here. The issue of women is very central for any reform. However, I would like you to keep in mind that really what attracted an immigrant like myself to the United States of America is the slogan of freedom. And our message should not be jumbled up. As we talk to the Muslim world, we have to be very clear that we are about freedom and democracy. Whether that democracy produces radical or non-radical, even if they were against us, as we know that there are institutions and mechanisms that allow them in as well as allow them out. We have to strengthen institutions inside the Muslim world that provide mechanisms for people to come into the public arena and debate on the basis of one man, one vote, and make sure also that these governments have the mechanisms to let them out as well when they are voted out. Thus far, these institutions do not exist. You might have one man, one vote, one time when the Islamists take over. If you have these safeguards, that indeed there is no chance for one man, one vote, one time in the case of maybe Iraq in the future or somewhere else. We need to strengthen the mechanisms to allow these people to leave. Now, our message, I think, would be absolutely dangerous for the United States of America to say that we are for selective democracy. We are democracy for this and for somebody else winning. We are against it. We are for democracy across the board. We are for participation across the board. Otherwise, I think what we are suffering from in the Muslim world, sir, right now, is that our message is jumbled up. Nobody in the Muslim world knows what is our message on Iraq, what's our message on Islam. Do we hate all Islam or half of it or radical only? I mean, we have not put out a strategically positioned message to the Muslim world telling them who we are and what we are all about. Now, if we can differ on tactical issues, specifically case-by-case basis, like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Oman, other things, but the overarching message, I think, with all due respect, ought to be uniform on the question of freedom and democracy. And that's what makes the United States of America attractive to the rest of the world. As we get jumbled up, we lose the thrust that made this country great.
Yes.
So I believe that the situation can be reversed. That is to identify what went wrong. America has been very generous to the countries in the Middle East and in Asian countries, especially the Muslim countries. But there is no gratitude. It is because American assistance and the relationship that America has had with the Middle East and Asia has been largely government to government. It is very important to invest more resources in public diplomacy, to educate the public, formally and informally in those countries. And I think that there must be a counter to Al Jazeera. There must be more work done to empower the non-governmental organizations in those countries. And I think that dealing with government to government has not created this goodwill. One example is the US government has been telling the Indonesian government prior to the attack in Bali, October 2002, that there is a terrorist network in Indonesia. But the US government did not tell the Indonesian people. So when Bali happened, the first reaction of the Indonesian people, or at least a segment of the people, was our military has done it. The people were not aware. So I think it is very important to invest in shaping the public opinion of the people in those countries, in public diplomacy.
Ms. Gorlick. Really.
Very, very interesting. I'd like to switch gears a little bit. The purpose of this hearing is really twofold. One is to understand the enemy so that we are assured that we're taking all possible steps to meet that enemy. But the other is to determine why we didn't see and appreciate the threat. And so I'd like to start with you, Dr. Gunaratna, and go back to 1988. You make a very powerful point in your writing, and you've alluded to it this morning, that Al-Qaeda was essentially born out of an emboldened Islamic movement, emboldened by the fact that it helped take down the Soviet Union by defeating it in Afghanistan, which of course we as a nation supported. We armed them, we supported them, we helped create this very potent force. And as you point out, in 1988, this movement was potent with no enemy remaining. What did we think at the time these people and this movement was going to do? And what were the flaws, if any, in our foreign policy and in our intelligence that led this group to turn its sights on us and our allies with seeming impunity? And also I'd like to hear from you, Professor Fandy, on that.
Madam, the Al-Qaeda was created before the Soviet troops left Afghanistan. The Soviet troops left Afghanistan in February 1989. Al-Qaeda was created in March 1988. But certainly Al-Qaeda became a very powerful organization because Al-Qaeda used the infrastructure it had built during at the height of the Cold War to fight the Soviet army. So certainly Al-Qaeda made use of the resources that came to Pakistan and Afghanistan for that purpose. The America did the right thing by supporting the Mujahideen to fight the Soviet army. But however, the failure of the international community, including the United States, was after the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan. The West turned a blind eye to Pakistan and Afghanistan. Pakistan, frontline state in the war against the Soviets, was abandoned. The US government threatened Pakistan, neglected Pakistan, neglected Afghanistan, And there were some Americans who told me at that time, oh, no, let them fight among each other. It really doesn't matter to us, you see.
If I might interrupt, as a student of that history, you can perhaps shed some light on what it was that we in the United States thought they would be doing. That is it your view that our view was they would simply fight among themselves and be of no threat to anyone else?
Madam, the US intelligence community had a very poor understanding of those movements. Al-Qaeda was created in March '88, but if you examine the CIA reports, until August 1998, none of the CIA reports refers to Osama bin Laden's organization as Al-Qaeda. It is referring to Osama bin Laden's organization as what? As the Islamic Army or as the UBL network. So that means for 10 years this organization existed, and I think you invest something like $30 billion on your intelligence for a year, right? But they did not know even the accurate name of Osama's organization that had declared war on you in 1996. So I think that you need to invest more in human source penetration. You need to divert some of your resources that you are investing in your technical collection into agent handling operations.
Professor Fandy, thank you.
I don't think we have to take all the blame on this. On Al-Qaeda, I think, is like any organization, is really part of these transnational movements. Throughout that part of the world, we have a great deal of a number of failed states throughout. And we are also, we're suckered in the process by other states in the neighborhood that gave us their radicals and say they will fight your jihad in Afghanistan. In fact, they were emptying out their societies of this threat, and we carried that baby throughout. And then we left them high and dry in Afghanistan. We had no plan for what to do in Afghanistan and how to deal with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, if you look at the makeup of Al-Qaeda, who are the foot soldiers of Al-Qaeda? These are people who came from the GIA in Algeria, came from the jihad in Egypt, came from supporters of bin Laden in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in also Europe. I mean, we have failed also to map we map the Muslim world in Europe, if you will. We have no understanding of how to map the Muslim world in Europe into the societies of Europe and where do they fit and all of that. It's a very complex problem that requires a lot of resources, requires cooperation from local governments. I think we could have done well had we subcontracted, if you will, how to fight Al-Qaeda to local regimes if they were willing, but because they know more and they understand them more, but somehow we failed to do so. I think it's very important to realize that we allowed offices here that are extremely dangerous in the United States, like Maktab al-Khadamat in New York or the Office of Jihad in New York and in other places. So the blowback effect was expected, given our understanding is that after the defeat of the Soviet Union, we had no understanding of the mop-up operation. I mean, we are always, and I think our pattern is clear even in Iraq. We win wars, but we don't know how to win peace. And I think that's really a broader issue. We have to understand how to win the peace. I think we did it in Europe, but we failed afterwards. I mean, after World War II, I think if it weren't for this whole plan of restructuring Europe, we created a Europe that's sustainable. But after that, I think we did not pay attention to this, and probably even the Iraq example can be very dangerous unless we come up with the strategy of winning the peace.
Thank you.
May I address this issue?
Certainly.
It turns out that of all three of us, I was the one who was over there at the time. I was the liaison officer with the Mujahideen until I left Islamabad. And my view of the history of Al-Qaeda is actually quite different since I was there. I must say that they didn't even come across our screen. They were an insignificant part of our fight against the Soviets. They were really a hindrance. As a matter of fact, whenever I heard about the Arab Afghans, it was really in very derogative terms by the Afghans themselves. They really were not part of that war. Now, they hijacked the notion that they were the one who actually kicked the Soviets out of Afghanistan, and they had good PR in that sense. But I don't really see that. Now, if you kind of have a linear view of history, as Dr. Gunaratna had, then you really discount the notion that the Gulf War happened. And I think Al-Qaeda is really more of a result of Gulf War and having our troops in Saudi Arabia and the progressive progression in ideology, as I try to really kind of outline in my statement. The designation of the United States as the priority really did not come until the mid-1990s. I mean, you cannot find that in 1988. I would completely disagree with that.
That's a very interesting perspective, and I apologize for forgetting that part of your very interesting nonlinear career. There really are not too many liaisons to the Mujahideen who are also practicing psychiatrists. And we are very happy to have that peculiar combination before us today. So let me actually follow up, if I might, because this is quite interesting. What you're saying is that while the infrastructure was in place so that at the time of, let's say, a provocation arising out of our very strong presence in the Gulf after the Gulf War, and particularly in Saudi Arabia, there really wasn't a decided threat to us between the fall of the Soviet Union and the victory, if you will, of the Mujahideen and others in Afghanistan and the period in the mid-1990s. But let me ask you then to put your liaison hat back on. Did we have the resources in place to identify the fact that in the 1990s, mid-1990s, that threat had turned on us?
I can only talk until I left the government in 1991, and at that point we did not. As I said, those Afghan Arabs did not come on our screen. And having been involved, I kind of followed that situation until I left in 91. We did not know them. We had no penetration of them, to my knowledge. They just were not relevant at that time. They became afterwards, during the exile in the Sudan, when we realized that there was a group there, and I think probably was the first time that they came on our screen. But this is speculation. I was already out of the government. I was out of the loop.
Well, thank you very much. I have a couple of other questions, if I might. I'd like to return, Dr. Fandy, to the point, Professor Fandy, to the point that you made about whether we are really enforcing, if you will, the president's view that we need to know who's with us and who is against us. You make the point that the financial aspects of the media in the Middle East really ought to be studied by us or by someone to determine what the support is for this massive propaganda machine focused on us. And this may not be a fair question to you, but here it is. Who do you say in the Middle East is with us and who is against us?
I think to be absolutely honest, everybody in the Middle East is ambivalent about us and about themselves. That there is political risks that's calculated locally throughout the neighborhood, that if they come out full swinging with the United States, that probably they might lose their power. Well, I mean, which is really sometimes not true. Everybody talks about the Middle East as the unstable area in the world. I can tell you this is the most stable area in the world. If people can rule for 18 and 20 and 30 years, that's very stable. We haven't seen overthrown of governments throughout. This is a very stable region, and people can afford to be with us. I think many countries are with us, but also secretly with us. I think Egypt helped us a great deal on intelligence after September 11th. But also Egypt failed to come full force and be straightforward about their total support for us.
So on the, if you were making a list that included public support and support in winning and helping to win the minds and hearts of the people, or at least presenting a fair presentation of the facts, you would find no one fully with us.
Well,
Is that correct?
I think no one is fully with us, and not only that, but there's something extra that needs to be carefully studied. I think there is something that can be called sort of Saddam settlements in the Arab media that need to be dismantled, and also Muslim Brotherhood settlements within the Arab media that need to be dismantled. It is disheartening if you study media organization that you find people who fought in Afghanistan now wearing three-piece suits and doing a talk show. This is preposterous, and I think we have the knowledge, and we know who is who amongst this group. We know who is supporting what newspaper, who is financing it. The problem is that sometimes we think that Arab media is very much like Western media. These are legitimate organizations somehow for freedom of expression. If you study certain newspapers that were created, the number of newspapers created by Saddam Hussein throughout the Arab world and by the Iraqi intelligence services, from London to Cairo to Paris, to other places, these are front organizations. We shouldn't have any misgivings to make clear that Al-Qaeda, like any other organization, has a media wing to it. It has a public affairs officers, and these officers exist and implanted in all Arab media, in the same way that they had officers within Arab armies and governments and things of that sort that supported them.
So, if I might summarize, your advice to us is not to superimpose our Western notions of what the press is and what its ethics and values are on what we see in the Middle East, and look at the funding and the actual activities of these
Who is
organizations.
who and who is doing what? I mean, this is very important to know.
Appreciate that. I have one final question. It was interesting to me that Dr. Gunaratna, in response to Senator Gorton's question, made a point of saying that the percentage of truly hostile individuals in the Muslim world is minuscule, even if support for their larger goals might be broader than that minuscule group. And so I'd like to address this question to Dr. Sagemen, because I don't have a lot of experience in foreign terrorism, but I have a lot of experience in domestic terrorism. And the analogy is far from perfect, but before the Oklahoma City bombing, there was a growing domestic terrorist threat in the United States. There was a proliferation of people who were overtly hostile and who were militant and who said that they wanted to do violence within this country. And what the government did in response was twofold. One was to raise the level of opprobrium in society for that sort of activity. We and the culture made it clear that violence was just not an appropriate tactic. And two, we infiltrated everybody we could possibly infiltrate. And the two tactics together, particularly after Oklahoma City, were, I think, quite successful. My question to you is twofold. One, should we just be worried about the minuscule group of actively hostile potential martyrs? Or do we need to be as worried about the societal support that I think Slade Gordon was getting at? And two, from your interviews and your sort of the texture you've drawn from the interviews you've done, what are the 2 or 3 best tactics we can use to diminish the potency of the violent groups?
Well, if I knew that, the government probably hire me to.
Well, we're considering that.
Oh, thank you. It's a very difficult two-pronged question. The first one is, when you have terrorism on your own soil, it hurts more. So the Saudis really were not concerned about 9/11. As a matter of fact, they dismissed it. It's not us. But when Riyadh happened, it became real to them. So I'm not really sure that the domestic analogy can really be transplanted to the foreign one. The second, we have to penetrate them, absolutely, just like we did here. But the key is really to prevent, even though the number of people are minuscule, there's 1.3 billion Muslims, they may be at most 2,000 people are willing to commit violence, which is an infinitesimal part of it. There is still a fairly large pool of people who want to graduate to that level, and what's missing is that human link. And what we're doing now is really the appropriate way of doing it, which is we don't really allow them to advertise freely in either Salafi mosques or in Saudi Arabia or anywhere else that, gee, I'm part of the jihad. If you guys want to sign up, just come and see me afterwards and I'll make the arrangements. So by eliminating that link, we just keep a potential pool, and not the reality of terrorism.
Thank you.
Madam, could I?
Certainly.
No terrorist group can sustain without flow of support. These organizations are continuing to grow like companies. They are growing because there is support. And that is why I said during my presentation that public diplomacy is very important. You have to invest in the public to create a societal norm and ethic against terrorism, and to say that these organizations are not Quranic organizations, that they are heretical organizations, that they are misinterpreting and misrepresenting Islam, that they are presenting a corrupt version of Islam. It is important to invest resources in that direction, because if you disrupt public support for these movements will die, they will perish, they will be very small in number, and they will not be able to conduct these type of high impact operations. I also want to go to the point that you raised with Professor Fandy about, are they with the United States? If we look at since 9/11, there have been arrests of 3,100 Al-Qaeda members and Al-Qaeda supporters, key supporters, in 102 countries of the world. These Muslim regimes in the Middle East and in Asia are perceiving the same threat that you are perceiving from these organizations. Because if we examine their trajectory, initially they want to topple those states and create Islamic states. Osama bin Laden said that it was too costly for them to conduct terrorist operations in the Middle East against those corrupt Muslim rulers and those false Muslim rulers and those corrupt Muslim governments, and said that they must change their strategy. Changing their strategy was, they said, they must attack the head of the poisonous snake, the United States, that was protecting, shielding those false Muslim rulers and those corrupt Muslim governments. That is why they decided to strike the head of the poisonous snake, the United States. You see? So in terms of the changing Al-Qaeda strategy of near targeting to distant targets and now returning back to the near targets, you see, it has generated equal amount of fear in those countries that they are being threatened by these groups. So I think the United States have received measure of cooperation. Today, the most important Al-Qaeda members, they are not detained in Guantanamo Bay. They are being detained in secret US facilities in those Middle Eastern and Asian countries, Muslim countries.
So if I can just summarize so that I can pass the baton to my colleague here, your views, while not wholly consistent, are one that we are getting good cooperation, if quiet cooperation, from many countries because it is in their own self-interest to do so, particularly since the attacks in Riyadh. But number two, we are failing to get that support in the whole area of public diplomacy and represented by the media and otherwise, which is permitting A, the flow of funds, and B, a degree of public acceptance of the kind of violence that has to be brought to an end. And I think that those are very strong takeaways for us today, and I thank you for your very helpful answers to my questions.
Congressman Roma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to, for 15 seconds, indulge our committee for just a comment to you and our distinguished Vice Chairman. Yesterday, as a chair and vice chair, as a Republican and as a Democrat, you went forward in a public press conference, and in your usual artful and diplomatic way, you both went forward with velvet gloves on and insisted that this commission get more cooperation from some of the agencies that have been dealing with us over the last several months and respond more forcefully to our aggressive search for facts and for substance and for information. I strongly applaud that bipartisan effort. It shows the consistency and the force of, I think, our commission on this point. I might have used some boxing gloves rather than the velvet gloves that you used, but with particular reference to the Department of Defense and to the CIA and FBI and Main Justice, unless we start getting more of the, not just a document flow, but important substantive documents, it's going to be very difficult for us to forcefully move forward and not just have important academics appear before us, but have people like Dr. Berger, who might have been in a position to know why we might have been slow in the 1990s to identify al-Qaeda. Dr. Rice, currently in the Bush administration, to answer some of these questions about how the Bush administration responded. That's very important for this commission, and I hope we can get the White House's cooperation to forcefully move these facts forward. Dr. Gunaratna, you studied in my hometown in South Bend, Indiana at the University of Notre Dame. You know how direct we can be in the Midwest. Let me start with a question with you, and then I want to get to one question for all three panelists. Mohammed Jamal Khalifa is an individual who is thought by some analysts and intelligence experts to have a direct link to al-Qaeda. He's a Saudi. He is someone who was mentioned in a January 21st, 2003 Christian Science Monitor article. In that article, you're quoted. Let me read your quote. Quote, had the U.S. followed the Khalifa case in the Philippines, I believe September 11th could have been averted, unquote. Extremely powerful words saying this one case was so important with an individual connected to all this that if the U.S. had done their job, things might have turned out differently. First of all, do you stick by that statement, that quote? Secondly, if you do, factually, in detail, and with substance, why is that true?
Sir, Mohammed Jamal Khalifa is the brother-in-law of Osama bin Laden. He arrived in the Philippines in 1988, and he became the first director, the founding director of the International Islamic Relief Organization of Saudi Arabia. He used the IIRO to funnel al-Qaeda funds
to the Abu Sayyaf group and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. He also hosted Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the brother-in-law of Ramzi Ahmad Yusuf, the first World Trade Center bomber. And what we are seeing is that the O-Plan Bojinka, the plan that Al-Qaeda had in 1994 to destroy 12 US airliners over the Pacific simultaneously, that operation was the genesis of 9/11 operation. If you read the interrogation of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is now in US custody, he has very clearly stated how 9/11 was planned, that it originated from O-Plan Bojinka.
Have you had access to those interviews and that information on Khalid Sheikh Mohammed?
Yes, sir. In fact, in that debriefing, he says very clearly that he put a bolt, a metal bolt, in his shoe, and he mounted, to test the security of the airports in the Far East. He traveled through to those airports, Seoul, Hong Kong, various other airports. So you can see that in the planning of 9/11, the original seeds was out of Philippines. And in fact, they did the first dry run for O-Plan Bojinka, where Ramzi Ahmad Yusuf, in fact, flew from Manila to Cebu on a Philippine airline plane, and he placed the nitroglycerin device under his seat. He got off the plane in Cebu, and there was an explosion when the plane was coming close to Japan. And it killed one Japanese, injured 7 or 8 others, made a hole in the fuselage. The plane was going to Narita Airport in Tokyo, but the skilled pilot landed it in the Naha Airport in Okinawa. And you can see that they were very serious. And the Americans were quite happy with the outcome of O-Plan Bojinka, because they arrested Ramzi Ahmad Yusuf in Pakistan, they arrested Wali Amin Khan Shah in Malaysia, they arrested Abdul Hakim Murad, the first Al-Qaeda pilot in the Philippines, but they failed to arrest Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of that operation.
But specifically, Dr. Gunaratna, if the U.S. understands the Bojinka plot, that weapons of planes could be used as weapons, how then, in not only understanding that plot, not only going back and knowing that a group had attacked the World Trade Center in 1993, how do you then avert 9/11 by following this one particular individual?
Sir, Muhammad Jamal Khalifa was in the Philippines and he was in touch with this group. But Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the more important man.
So you say eventually you get Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and that prevents 9/11 from occurring?
Absolutely, because Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the mastermind of 9/11. He organized that whole operation. The first planning meeting of 9/11 was held from the 5th to the 8th of January in Kuala Lumpur. Who chaired that meeting? Khalid Sheikh Mohammed chaired that meeting. The first 2 hijackers to enter the United States, they were present at that meeting. So the 9/11 operation is an extension of O-Plan Bojinka. So the players of O-Plan Bojinka, they were not all arrested.
Let me continue to pursue that line of questioning in a minute. Let me go to Dr. Fandy for a question as well. Sure. Dr. Fandy, a former CIA agent by the name of Robert Baer writes in the May Atlantic Monthly issue that particularly he's concerned about Saudi Arabia's support for fundamentalism and for terrorism abroad. He states in this article many things, but one of them, he claims that the Saudis have transferred $500 million to Al-Qaeda over the past decade. Now, do you think that there is any kind of credibility to a figure like that? How would you be able to track that, and how would you measure the Saudi support with the United States for fighting terrorism prior to 9/11?
To just be absolutely honest, I just don't know this figure. I did not come across this figure. And also the idea of wire transfer or transfer of funds, I can probably say probably throughout the Arab world, people use cash and not banking systems. So it's very difficult to actually trace it unless the origin of the money came from a Western country, unless there is something that's really, the idea that I haven't seen from my study of Saudi Arabia that people use checks or even when they use bank deposit, this is not a really large group of the society. Most people get their salaries in cash. So the idea of wire transfers with that amount of money has to originate somewhere else. It could have connection to Saudi Arabia.
I think he insinuates, as Dr. Gunaratna did, with respect to Mohammed Jamal Khalifa, that some of the money was funneled through charities and other things.
That's right. I think that's the very central question for really looking at Saudi Arabia, is to look at these charities. And I talked to Saudis about this in interviews in terms of what do they think of that. And I think sometimes they come off as these are the unintended consequences of bad politics, that somehow they decided to upgrade Saudi Arabia's image in the Muslim world, therefore they tried to help the poor with schools, with other places, not knowing that the ideology as well as the manning of these organizations was hijacked by Al-Qaeda members. So there is, I have no way of assessing whether this is an honest claim or a dishonest claim, but I would say that probably, given what I know about Saudi Arabia, that this is probably the unintended consequences of bad policy and lack of foresight and long-term planning. You see mosques and other things being supported by Saudi Arabia, even in the United States. But Saudi students use them for 4 years until when they are here, and then they are taken over by other people. So there is no follow-up for these organizations. Well, money from Saudi Arabia went to various groups of the Mujahideen. There was certain cultural support that this is a good thing to fight the Soviet Union. Also, money went to organizations that were fighting in Europe, in Bosnia, to support their Muslim brothers and their co-religionists, if you will, who are embattled in Europe. Yes, a lot of money went into that, but how it's being used and who used it, it is very difficult to actually say that certain money was authorized by, let's say, officials or something of that sort. But certainly there was a sentiment in Saudi Arabia that at the time was encouraging people to support these charities. Now, I think this is a very important issue to think about as we think about probably phase 2 in the war on terrorism, really sort of drying up these resources, or drying up the swamps, if you will. We are looking at really educational institutions and charities. We are looking at really the software of the Muslim world, if you will. I mean, the hardware and the money and everything else can be looked at very carefully, but the software, the educations, what is in the Muslim world's head, how people are being raised and educated and other things, this is our task, and that requires investigating very carefully educational institutions, investigating very carefully charities, investigating very carefully textbooks, and whatever goes into that bad software, we have to rewrite that software, if you will. And if we don't rewrite it, nobody else will rewrite it.
So in response to Commissioner Gorelick's question about emphasizing public diplomacy, emphasizing non-government to government aid, emphasizing more help for the types of schools that can educate young, poor children, not in madrasas, but in other ways, that is extremely important to U.S. efforts in the future. On the same hand, some of the charitable work that supports those efforts can be diverted for terrorism, and that money can be raised in places like Saudi Arabia, or as Dr. Gunaratna talked about, in the Philippines and diverted to Abu Sayyaf.
Or United Arab Emirates and other places. The main issue for public diplomacy is that we have done a lot for the world. I think our problem is that you find schools that we built in Egypt or in Indonesia or other places are the people who took credit for these schools. If you read the names of these schools, what they were called, these were not called American schools or came to you through the assistance of the United States. It's called Sheikh so-and-so school or this Muslim radical leader. So we are paying the money, but the branding of these schools is going to somebody else. And we are very much like the Ottoman Empire in many ways. We do not follow what the pashas that we are supporting throughout the whole world, what they're doing. We visit them once a year and that's it. We don't do follow-up. And empires, sir, should have always have to have Philby and Shakespeare and Lawrence of Arabia and people who knows the realm of the empire. We don't know the realm that we are claiming to have control over. We don't have the expertise, languages, and other things. And all of this really has to be put in place. We have to follow up. We have to follow our money. Even our money can go to Al-Qaeda, believe it or not. So it is very important to just do these, create institutions and systems of follow-ups to know where our charities are our own charities are going. Our aid sometimes goes to corrupt systems that find their way to also illegitimate use of our own money. So in many ways, unless we have to understand this big picture. There is a phase 2 of war on terrorism that's drying the swamps. And here are the mechanisms that are in place. I think most of us get worried about tactical, small, anecdotal evidence and try to draw a big picture from that. That's not a good approach to it. The whole plumbing system in the Muslim world is broken. And the Muslim world was if you pardon the expression, was flushing in its own neighborhood for years, and we tolerated it, and now September 11th, they flushed, and it came to New York. Unless we fix that sink and that system and that plumbing system, it is our duty. Nobody else will fix it. People will enjoy drinking their bath water because they've been drinking it for years.
I appreciate your testimonies and your direct proposals to try to fix the plumbing systems with other governments, with our bilateral programs with other governments, with our relationships with other governments, and all those governments in the Middle East should be on the table. I think the U.S., looking medium and long term, should look at ways to give incentives and carrots and sticks to Egypt and Saudi Arabia to try to fix some of those problems. Dr. Sagemen, let me end with you. I know my colleagues are anxious to ask you questions. You have intimately looked at the structure of Al-Qaeda. And what's interesting about your testimony is you look at these pretty sophisticated individuals, fairly well educated, coming from middle-class backgrounds, without a lot of family historical problems, that are in cells in Europe, in Hamburg. And they eventually come up with this plot. They combine with muscle, so-called muscle, on the airplanes coming over from Saudi Arabia. About 15 of the hijackers come in. They mix together in the United States and pull off one of the most devastating attacks in our nation's history and kill over 3,000 people. It's a group of very sophisticated people coming with some other people from other backgrounds. Is Al-Qaeda capable of this kind of plot, pulling this kind of plot off successfully here and now today?
I don't think so at this point. But if we relax
And
our
why?
vigilance, well, because we're far more vigilant right now. And perhaps we might have swung the other way, where anybody who looks a little bit strange is now a guest of the FBI. But this will fade with time. People really get tired of being so vigilant. So I'm not saying that in a few years from now they won't be able to do it. Right now, today, no.
In the United States?
In the United States,
But
that's yes.
somewhere else they could, Dr. Gunaratna, do you agree with that?
Sir, there are 3 reasons why Al-Qaeda has failed to mount large-scale terrorist operation in the United States since 9/11. One is heightened public vigilance. As long as the public are alert, terrorist group cannot plan, prepare, and organize big terrorist attack. Second is that there is unprecedented security, intelligence, and law enforcement cooperation in the United States and by the US agencies with agencies outside the United States, including in the Asian and the Middle Eastern countries. And the third reason is that today Al-Qaeda is being aggressively hunted. When you hunt a terrorist organization relentlessly, that group does not have the time, space, or the resources to plan, prepare, and execute big operation like 9/11. So if you can maintain these 3 elements, you will not suffer another attack of that scale.
And that's not to preclude the smaller, less expensive types of attacks that we see on soft targets around the world.
Certainly, sir. You will continue to witness attacks of the scale of Bali, of Mombasa, of Casablanca, of Riyadh in the next few years, because Al-Qaeda and its associate groups are still able to plan, prepare, execute those operations, especially in the poorer countries of the world, of Asia, of Africa, of the Middle East, of the Caucasus.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cleland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you and the staff for assembling the most profound group of witnesses I've ever seen to talk about the enemy that attacked us and the rationale for that and the understanding that we need to deal with this in the future. I would say that if the government doesn't hire all of you by sunset today, it's making a big mistake. Just a couple of one-liners here. Dr. Sagemen, as a liaison with out of Pakistan to the Mujahideen in Pakistan, and as a psychiatrist, I just want to know, how long have you been feeling this way? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Professor
You should ask my wife.
Yeah, that's right. Professor Fandy, I was fascinated by one little tidbit that you threw out, and that is, and I just want to verify it, that that the Muslim Brotherhood has an office in Qatar, where our CENTCOM headquarters is, and in other foreign countries like Indonesia and Virginia.
Virginia is not a foreign country.
I know. Is that really true?
Well, I think, I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood is the mother of all these movements in the final analysis. If you go and trace all the ideas and the ideology that drove these 15 hijackers to drive these planes into the World Trade Center, it's the ideas of Sayyid Qutb and Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi and all of that came from the Muslim Brotherhood. Yes, one of the major figures of the Muslim Brotherhood leaders is Sheikh al-Qaradawi, who lives in Qatar, who is the man actually who selected who is who amongst the Muslim Brotherhood members who became the staff of Al Jazeera station. He's a very influential figure in Qatar, very central recruiter. He chairs also the Muslim Fatwa in Sweden, believe it or not, with the Muslim Brotherhood in Sweden creating these offices. So when there was the change of the guard last year of who heads the Muslim Brotherhood after the death of their Grand Murshid, these men were consulted from Lebanon to France to Sweden to Qatar to other places. There is a Muslim Brotherhood International, if you will, that's an assembly of the men who were driven out of Egypt during Nasser and stayed from Saudi Arabia and other places in the world. I stand by that statement, sir. I mean, mostly Al-Qaeda and all these Islamic groups, when you see the relationship with America, they are not standing next to us as number three. They are right there in our shoulders. There was a Muslim Brotherhood organization that I came across in 1992 that was in Virginia and Maryland as well. So there is an extensive network of Islamic movements throughout the United States that has not been studied. And it's not been studied very carefully. Now, one thing that I would like to emphasize here as we think of Muslims in America, some of us started to really look at Islam in the same way as Christianity is. So we look at a mosque in the same way we look at a church. That's not true. There are Muslims who go only once a week to the mosque. The mosque is not a social organization. The mosque is a place where you receive your religious guidance, but not necessarily. I mean, the mosque is not the parallel of the church, but somehow this Islamic organization made it clear to us that there is this sanctity of front door mosques, if you will, and things of that sort. These are open for investigations, and one should look into how mosques are being built and where the money came from.
Well, thank you. I want to give some thoughts and my about Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. In listening to your conversation, I've been thinking about a quote that, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave," particularly in this murky world of covert or special operations and dealing with guerrillas, suicide bombers, and the like. As a Vietnam veteran, I'm painfully aware that during World War II, the OSS actually dropped supplies to Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh because they were fighting our enemy at the time, Japan, and the Japanese were in formerly French Indochina, and in effect, Ho Chi Minh was our guy because he was fighting our enemy. And matter of fact, it was Ho Chi Minh who was a big fan of Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence and could quote it extensively. As a matter of fact, about the point about getting our word out and our message out about freedom and democracy, I was talking to one of the staffers yesterday who's an expert in the Middle East. He said one of the best things we could do is just circulate the Declaration of Independence throughout the Middle East to the population there. And by the way, I was thinking about Slade Gordon's question about only men could vote in Kuwait and only a third could vote and women couldn't vote, and they elected some terrorists and so forth. I thought about the history of our own country. That was 1776, and the terrorists were Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington. So the point being, though, that at one time, Ho Chi Minh was our guy. After the Second World War, Roosevelt did not want to go back into support France and French Indochina. He did not believe in the colonialization of that area. Churchill did. Ultimately, we wound up supporting the French as they went back in. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh fought the French. We ultimately supported them to about 80% of that war, and they lost it. We got in there, and I was part of the 10-year American War in formerly French Indochina, and in effect fought Ho Chi Minh's North Vietnamese and VC. Now, interestingly enough, the Russians supported the Ho Chi Minh. Well, you go now to Afghanistan. There, what a tangled web we weave. We are supporting the Mujahideen because they're fighting the Russians, who are our enemy, and Afghanistan becomes their Vietnam, and we're supporting the guys that now we call the terrorists, who then we abandoned as the Mujahideen, and now they turned into the people that we're now fighting. We're calling them terrorists. Interestingly enough, too, now, in the Iraq-Iranian war, silently and tacitly, we supported Saddam Hussein because of the extremists that took over Iran and captured American prisoners and so forth and so forth. And now then Saddam Hussein became the bad guy, and we took him out. Now here's the question. In this massive world of 1.3 billion Muslims, with obviously an avant-garde of Osama bin Laden and his terrorist organization and other terrorist organizations springing up. And Dr. Sagemen, did you say that in many ways Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda kind of got a jump start after the Desert War in 1991? I'd like to read to you a question, statement of Senator Chuck Hagel, Republican from Nebraska, who was on the Foreign Relations Committee and my fellow Vietnam veteran, a statement that he made before the National Press Club, June 19, 2003. Because what I'm trying to get at here, that you all described a milieu in which the United States functions either well or ill, particularly in this troubled part of the world, the Middle East. Senator Hagel says the June 2003 survey of the Pew PEW Global Attitudes Project should be a rousing alarm clock, not merely a wake-up call to all Americans regarding the perception of America in the world today. You were talking about America not getting credit, no gratitude, and so on. The Pew Project relied on public opinion surveys from 44 nations in the summer and fall of last year, and further data from 21 countries in April and May of this year, for a total survey sample of 54,000 people. The survey finds a disconcerting message regarding American leadership and credibility. From the Pew poll, Senator Hagel quotes, "The Iraq War has widened the rift between Americans and Western Europeans, further inflamed the Muslim world, softened support for the war on terrorism, and significantly weakened global support for the pillars of the post-World War II era, the UN and the North Atlantic Alliance." Isn't that the kind of news that Osama bin Laden and the radical Islamic extremists would welcome? And isn't that actually creating more problems for us, more terrorism, more potential for attacks against the West? And isn't this bad news? And is the Iraq War making it more difficult to get after the terrorists? Or is it making it easier, especially since we're there with 250,000 troops in Kuwait and Iraq with no end in sight and no exit strategy? Dr. Gunaratna? Yeah.
Sir, terrorists themselves cannot muster large-scale support. They do not have the organization to do that. It is often the overreaction of states, of state actors, that lead to the generation of large-scale support. That is why when we fight terrorist organizations, we must ensure that there is no overreaction or there is no underreaction. Because if we do not react properly to a terrorist group, the terrorists will think we are weak and they will attack us. That is why after USS Cole, no effort. At least when East Africa was attacked, you fired 70 cruise missiles. It did not have a positive impact. But after USS Cole, you did not do anything. So it is important for there to be some action, but there must not be underreaction or overreaction. The overreaction to 9/11 was US intervention in Iraq. Iraq never posed a direct and an immediate threat to the United States. It was Al-Qaeda and the associate groups of Al-Qaeda that posed a direct and immediate threat to the United States. So US intervention in Iraq, to get rid of one man, you invaded his country. It was again the failure of the intelligence community to get rid of that one man. You do not have to risk all those troops by going into a country to get rid of one man. You said that we took him out. You referring to Saddam Hussein, you said we took him out. No, sir, you have not taken him out. He's still there. He's still challenging you. As long as the core and the penultimate leadership of any government or any organization, whether in exile or not, is active, that organization will pose a threat to you. So what we are looking is, US intervention in Afghanistan was fully justified. People fully supported you. But your intervention in Iraq, you have not received that scale of support. In fact, that intervention has not earned goodwill towards America. It has earned some criticism and some displeasure. And the terrorist organizations will harness that displeasure and that resentment and that anger in the Muslim world, and they will grow in strength and size, and they will become a greater threat to you with time. By going into Iraq, you have not reduced the threat of terrorism to the United States in any way.
And in your opinion, maybe increased it?
Certainly. Saddam Hussein, with finance and perhaps with access to certain special weapons, may be a greater threat today than he was in power in that country. We could have had a different attitude, a different response to him at that time than in a day like today.
And we have 240,000 soldiers at risk in Kuwait and Iraq now.
So also we must look at the picture, the overall picture in the Middle East. Overnight, the United States have become the immediate neighbor of Iran and of Syria. And we must never forget that in 1983, Iranian-sponsored Lebanese Hezbollah conducted a coordinated simultaneous suicide attack against the French and the American bases. You lost 241 American troops, which was the single biggest loss you suffered in such an attack prior to 9/11.
That was Lebanon, right? The
Yes,
Khobar
in
Towers.
Lebanon. But no, sir.
No.
I am referring to the attack on the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, where
Beirut, yes,
Hezbollah
yes.
conducted a suicide attack. The point that I want to make here is that the disposition of Iran and towards Syria has not dramatically changed towards the United States. Today, the United States is the immediate neighbor of Iran and Syria. You are in an area where you do not have very good friends.
We've got time
Dr.
for just...
Sagemen? Dr. Sagemen?
I'm very short. Basically, Senator, you've increased the pool of potential terrorists, but you still need
Increase the pool of potential terrorists?
but you still need to make the linkage for Osama bin Laden to be able to tap into it. You still need that link. There is no direct translation from anger to against the United States to being a terrorist. You still need the training, you still need the resources, and unless you have that link, you're not going to increase terrorists.
Thank you. Professor Fandy?
I think I have the opposite view on this one. Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, and Ayman al-Zawahiri, they are born in the Arab and Muslim context. And after people in Iraq saw the mass graves that Saddam Hussein left, actually there is a change of opinion. What we need is the support of states to actually come out and condemn Saddam Hussein for what he did to the Iraqi people. I think the American presence in the region is reassuring for its stability. There is no single state on its own. And we've seen in 1990, we waited for the Arab solution for the reversal of the invasion of Iraq to Kuwait and never materialized. I think it is the responsibility of the superpower to ensure the stability of that part of the world. I think taking out Saddam Hussein and his regime will encourage Arab states to become part of a regional arrangement for peace solutions that regulates relationship amongst all the Middle Eastern states. And also, as we push with the new agenda of reform, we can regulate the relationship between governments and their own people. And with a package like this, probably we can dry the swamps, if you will, for the issue of terrorism. I'm not sure that that will increase the risks. I think the biggest story during the Iraq War is that there was there was an Arab country, a major Arab country being attacked. Its leadership has been changed. I have yet to hear of one attack on a single soft target for America during that war. That was the biggest story, that there was a tacit support for that war on the part of the people who were concerned. Syria draw a lesson from this war. Iran is drawing lessons from this war. All the neighborhood are drawing lessons from this war. People know now that America is a Middle Eastern country, if you will. It has borders with Syria and whatever it is, and it can attend even Arab League meetings. So it is now the Middle East is our responsibility. We have to fix it. We cannot worry about. We cannot afford to fail in Iraq.
Well,
put it simply.
Young Americans are being killed every day, and it seems like in a few weeks, more Americans will have been killed after the president, in effect, declared victory than during the actual combat. And this seems to be unending. That seems to me to look more like Vietnam and Somalia than Desert One. And I just wonder if you feel, how long is this going to go on? How many Americans we're going to lose before this thing gets cleared up?
I think there is a threshold in terms of what kind of numbers can we afford, but it's very important to get Middle Eastern states themselves to stand by us, shoulder to shoulder, that indeed they support this operation. Thus far, we do not have the open support, and we need to get that. Secondly, I think we are ambiguous about Iraq like we are ambiguous about everything else. Iraqis and Middle Easterners want to hear probably from America that we own Iraq for the next 3 years and come back to us after 3 years, and we'll give it to you. But right now, nobody knows when will America leave. Is this force of occupation? So that whole ambiguous and atmosphere that's not clear, creating in the minds of many Iraqis that this might go for a long, long time. We need to give these people a timetable as to when we're going to put together an Iraqi government and when we are leaving.
Well, right now, the 3rd Infantry Division out of Fort Stewart, Georgia, owns part of Iraq, and some of those are getting killed every day. It's one of my concerns. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. We're running out of time, so I'll ask the commissioners to ask a quick question. If you could confine your answers as concisely as possible. Senator Gorton.
One specific question. One or more of you used the phrase failed states in connection with at least part of the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And I suppose if there were a gold medal for failed states, it would be Somalia. And several of you have mentioned that Somalia, of course, now is a source or a base for terrorism. What would your advice be to the United States with respect to its views toward Somalia? Should we be attempting anything there to bring democracy, justice, a reduction of a terrorist base in that most failed of all states?
So the United States must work with the other states in the Horn of Africa, trying to bring stability in Somalia. Already Al-Qaeda maintains a presence in Somalia. A few months ago, the CIA took a very important Al-Qaeda man out of Somalia. Of course, that operation was successful because the CIA was able to work with a certain faction in Somalia that cooperated with the US government. I believe that the other governments in the Horn of Africa will assist and work together with the United States to ensure that stability is restored in Somalia. It is very important to do what it takes to prevent countries from failing, because it is in such countries that terrorist organizations will base themselves. Terrorists are like sharks. They rapidly move in search of such opportunities where there is a lack of law and order, and where they can recruit, establish training camps, and continue to fight.
Either of the other comment?
I think Somalia is paramount for the United States. From the history of the Cold War until today, it's strategically important. During the Cold War, it was strategically important. Somalia, Djibouti, and all that trade in the Red Sea, it's very important for us strategically, but also it's very important that to show that indeed America cares, and we do care. I think we cared about the Muslim world in Europe, and we have not made the case for that. It is very important to make a case that also we care in putting together another Muslim country and make it work. Otherwise, I would agree with my colleague that it will be a safe haven for all these terrorist organizations.
Well, let me kind of put a little spoke in those wheels. Despite being a failed state, Somalia still cooperated with the CIA in arresting that Al-Qaeda officer. It's not so much the failed state, because there are a lot of failed states in Africa, and they don't really seem to be all that promoting terrorism. They have their own problems. Congo, for instance, being one, or even Nigeria. But Nigeria is not a failed state. The point is that even in failed states, you can work with various factions. It's not the failed state itself. It's really the failed state that allows training bases to be there for skills and resources to develop large terrorist operation. You can very well work with a various faction in failed state to prevent that from happening. So it's not so much a failed state itself. It's the opportunity that they allow in terms of developing those bases.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Commissioner Benveniste?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to commend the staff for assembling a series of panels, this panel in particular, for providing us with a very stimulating discussion this morning. I would like to pick up on the subject of the future of terrorism, and which is, of course, a central issue to our mandate as a commission, and address my question to Professor Fandy, who talked earlier about the importance of winning the peace in Iraq. And I would like you to comment on Dr. Sagemen's statement that it was the U.S. force deployment in Saudi Arabia following Gulf War I that substantially stimulated the growth of Al-Qaeda. On the one hand, we have this set in motion by reason of the invasion of Iraq, a full menu of disparate forces within that country seeking hegemony, or at least a substantial say in the future of Iraq. We have the Kurds in the north, the interests of the Turks, the Shias in the south, the influence of Iran to be dealt with, the clerical movement that is strong and afoot, the disenfranchised and unemployed Sunnis who were formerly in power and now don't have a paycheck, many of them from the army. All of this militates for our need to stay the course and sort all of this out. Yet, at the same time, our mere presence in Iraq in these very substantial numbers stimulates the recruitment of jihadists. if not to Al-Qaeda, but to other groups which may not yet be on our collective screens as we go forward. How do we deal with this dichotomy of it being both a benefit to have removed this tyrant and yet at the same time unleashing forces in that part of the world which will perhaps, as we have heard today, greatly stimulate the recruitment and growth of other jihadist movements?
Well, sir, the question, if we zero in on Iraq and look at the very specific data about Iraq, we know that really in Iraq we do not have a problem, let's say, in Kurdistan. America does not have a problem in Kurdistan. In fact, you know, the Kurds were celebrating the U.S. Independence Day. Unlike, I mean, there was a huge celebration of
The Turks were not celebrating.
the Turks were not celebrating next door. There's also general stereotypes that the Shia of the South are very much influenced by Iran and very much can turn the whole thing sour. In fact, the level of terrorism in the southern part of Iraq is very limited. The leader of the Shia, Sheikh al-Hakim, Baqir al-Hakim, and others put out at least moderate statements about their view of the change of forces in Iraq. The problem of Iraq is really about the Sunni center that lost its control of power over the 30 years of Saddam's rule and before. These are the people who are kicking and screaming for that change of power distribution inside Iraq. So to really exaggerate that question and make it, this is the question of the whole Iraq, there are a variety of attitudes in Iraq about the U.S. I would say the most recent polls that I read, it was only 20% were not grateful. The rest of the Iraqis saw the United States as a liberating
Well,
force.
without
and so on.
delving too deeply, because we don't have the time, would it be fair to say that without the United States military presence, we would be in a situation, or Iraq would be in a situation, where it would be very likely that all of these elements would soon be at each other's throats? My question goes to Dr. Sagemen's observation, and perhaps Dr. Gunaratna shares this view, in view of his earlier comments, that this has provided a very substantial recruiting poster, if you will, given the history of recruitment post the deployment of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia following the Gulf War for future jihadist and militant and vicious attacks on our own populations.
The different posture, the poster that people read also in the region, that the United States is here and here to change bad regimes that committed huge crimes against their own people, and there are also a lot of recruitment for that's going on.
So there may be a win-win situation for the jihadists and the pro-American sentiment, such as it is
I think the
in that region.
jihadists are the losers in the Iraq thing. I think it shows that the United States is capable and willing to commit its forces to actually, after September 11th, the whole strategic environment changed, that we are forceful about the deployment of our force. We're no longer reluctant, and that is a very strong message.
Could we have a brief comment from each of the other two?
So I disagree. I believe that Iraq has the potential to become the new theater for jihadis, to psychologically and physically for them to train and to conduct operations against the United States, its allies and its friends. And I believe that the flow of foreign fighters into Iraq, Syria and Iran has not done much. And I believe that these fighters are now coming mostly from North Africa, from the Middle East, and with time there will be people who will come from Asia, from Europe, the cradle and the convert Muslims, from the Caucasus, and unless the United States takes decisive action to to control the flow of these foreign fighters and also to stabilize the situation in Iraq, Iraq will become a very important, very significant theater for these jihadis.
So you prescribe more force.
More force and also more
Smarter
diplomacy.
force.
More diplomacy. You have to target and destroy Saddam Hussein and his key people who are inside that country. You have to deal with Iran and Syria in such a way where the flow of these foreign fighters will be blocked. If you do not do that, you will continue to have more US troops dying in Iraq every day, and the number will increase.
Dr. Sagemen, do you agree?
No, actually, I sit on the fence. Before, you kind of almost offered me a job here. Now you kind of offer me Paul Bremer's job. Thank you. I think the two scenarios are plausible, and Iraq is both a threat and a promise, and that really very much depends on what Paul Bremer is going to do. They're very likely, both of them, and at this point it's too early to tell which one will unfold.